My daughter-in-law said I was a failure, but froze when the Smithsonian asked for my quilt. I still remember the way Kate looked at me that Sunday. We were sitting around her spotless oak table, the kind she probably saw on one of those lifestyle shows. Everything matched. The placemats, the salad forks, even the candle in the middle that nobody dared light. I had brought my lemon pie, the one I've made every holiday since 1984. But this time, it just sat there untouched. Kate poured water from a glass pitcher and said, real casual like, we only invite you because it's polite. She didn't even blink, just kept setting down glasses, like what she said wasn't a punch to the gut. You've never really done anything important. The room went quiet. My hands were in my lap, right under the tablecloth. I rubbed my thumbs together, hoping maybe I'd misheard her. But I hadn't. My son, Thomas, sat across from me. He didn't look up, just scooped more potatoes onto his plate like he was watching paint dry. Not a word from him. Not even a, Kate, that's enough. That's what hurt more than anything. Not her words. Him letting them sit in the air like they were true. I looked around the table. Their daughter, Lily, was on her phone, half listening. She's 16 now. I helped raise her when they both worked double shifts years ago. Changed her diapers, read her bedtime stories, helped her memorize state capitals for a 5th grade quiz. But today, I was just polite company. The pie still hadn't moved. I had placed it gently on their granite counter when I walked in, even brought it in my best glass dish, the same one my own mother gave me before she passed. It had a tiny chip on the handle, but I never replaced it. Something about it made me feel like she was still around when I used it. I looked at the pie, then back at Kate. She was folding her napkin and reaching for her wine glass like she hadn't just gutted me, with a smile. Thomas finally spoke, but it wasn't to me. Katie, can you pass the bread? Not Mom. Not even a glance. I don't know what got into me. Maybe it was just being tired of being invisible. I slowly pushed my chair back. It made a loud scratch on their perfect floor. I stood up. Steady. Quiet. I think I'll head out. No one argued. Kate said, "Oh, all right," like I'd offered to take the trash out. Thomas nodded. Still didn't look up. I walked to the door. Slipped on my shoes. I looked back once, hoping, just hoping for something. Maybe Lily would say, "Thanks for coming, Grandma." Maybe Thomas would say, "Call me when you get home." But nothing. I opened the door myself, closed it behind me. The wind hit my face as I stepped outside. The sun was out, but it didn't feel warm. I sat in my car for a minute with the keys in my hand, not even turning them, just sitting there with that quiet that follows a gut punch. That pie was still on the counter. I left it there. Let them toss it or eat it. I didn't care. Driving home was a blur. The roads looked the same as they always did, flat stretches, strip malls, a tire shop, and the same faded American flag waving above the fire station. But something in me had shifted. They didn't want me there. Not really. They wanted the idea of me. The grandmother who shows up, brings pie, smiles politely, doesn't take up too much space. And if I did more than that, if I had feelings, opinions, or a past of my own, that made me inconvenient. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car longer than I should have. I didn't want to go inside. Not because the house was empty. I'd gotten used to that years ago. I just didn't want to sit in a space where their voices used to echo back when they still needed me. When I finally walked in, the house felt colder than usual. I turned the heat up, put the kettle on, but even the whistle from the stove felt far away. I sat at the table, stared at my hands. Never done anything important. That's what she said, as if raising a family, surviving loss, helping neighbors, patching jeans, making dinners, sitting in waiting rooms, praying during surgeries, holding space when no one else would. as if none of that counted. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry, just empty. I thought about calling someone, but who? My sister passed last winter. My cousin June had started forgetting things and would just ask if I was still teaching Sunday school, something I hadn't done in 15 years. I picked up a pen, just a cheap blue one from the bank. I opened an old notebook from the kitchen drawer and started to write, not to anyone, just to remember that I still had a voice. Maybe nobody else cared, but I did. And if no one ever read it, at least it was mine. They didn't even look up when I left. If you've ever felt like a ghost in your own family, leave a comment below. And if you're watching from her Kindle, please subscribe. You being here means more than you know. I didn't touch my sewing room for a few days after that Sunday dinner. It sat just off the kitchen, small, cluttered, sun-soaked in the mornings, and filled with decades of fabric stacked like old stories. Fat quarters, jelly rolls, thread combs I'd wound by hand. Baskets full of scraps I swore I'd use one day. I had folded some of them with my mother when I was still a teenager. Back then, quilting wasn't a hobby. It was a way of life, a necessity, a gift. My grandmother made quilts during the war out of rationed flour sacks. My mother stitched through grief when my father passed. And I sewed through marriage, motherhood, loss, and every silence in between. But none of that mattered anymore. Not to Kate. A few years ago, I offered her and Thomas one of my finished pieces, a full-size double wedding ring I'd spent nearly 6 months piecing and hand quilting. Real curved pieces, too. Not a pattern for beginners. I wrapped it carefully in a ribbon and handed it to her with a small smile. Kate looked at it, blinked slowly, and said, "Oh, that's nice." Then she added with a little laugh, "But we don't really do old lady crafts in the house. Too busy looking, you know." She didn't mean it to be cruel. At least, I don't think she did. But I remember the way she handed it back a few days later. Folded too tightly, the fabric creased in ways that told me it hadn't been opened, let alone appreciated. I tucked it back into the cedar chest in my sewing room. Didn't say a word. Later that year, I asked if Lily, my granddaughter, might like a quilt when she left for college. Kate smiled, polite as ever, and said, "Oh, I think she'd rather take a weighted blanket or something modern." Modern. It's funny how that word becomes a weapon as you get older. It tells you your hands aren't needed anymore, that what you carry doesn't belong, that your skills are relics, not roots. I tried joining a local arts guild in the fall of 2021. I had heard they were starting a folk textiles group. I brought a few pieces to the meeting, nothing too fancy, just a log cabin variation and a bow tie sampler. When it was my turn to share, one of the women, maybe in her early 40s, flipped through them and said, "Oh, these are very traditional." Then she turned to the others and added, "We're really looking for more experimental work this season. Something with edge. Edge." I'd lived through 2 recessions, a war, a breast cancer scare, and burying both my parents, and now I needed edge to be seen. I smiled, said thank you for your time, packed up quietly, drove home in silence. That night, I pulled out my smallest quilt, the one I'd made for Thomas when he was born. Faded blue flannels, shaped like sailboats. The stitches were uneven. My tension was terrible back then, but it held up. I pressed it, folded it, and placed it in a paper bag. The following Sunday, I left it in the donation box at my church. No name, no note, just a little piece of me out in the world. And then I started doing it regularly. Every month or so, I'd take one of the quilts from the chest, tidy it up, stitch the label out, and drop it off quietly, anonymously. Some went to raffles, some to shelters. A few ended up at the local VA hospital. I never told a soul, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want another one of those looks. You know the kind, where someone smiles at you like you're a child with macaroni art. After a while, I stopped expecting anyone to want what I made. That's when I started sewing just for the sound. The gentle rhythm of the needle, the way fabric softened in my hands, the hum of my old Singer machine, the quiet it created in my head when the world outside felt too sharp. My sewing room became more than a room. It was memory. It was prayer. It was the one place where I didn't need permission to matter. Some nights, I'd sit in there past midnight, working by lamplight, listening to the wind against the window and the thread moving through cotton. I didn't have to prove anything, not to Kate, not to Thomas, not even to myself. But that didn't stop the ache, because deep down, deep down, I still wish someone had said, "These are beautiful. These are worth keeping." You are. You know, it's strange what loneliness sounds like when you're used to filling it with fabric and pins. It's not loud. It doesn't scream. It just settles in your chest like something heavy you learn to carry. If you've ever spent hours making something, anything, and no one seemed to care, I want you to know you're not alone. There's a reason you found this story. And maybe, just maybe, there's a reason I kept sewing even when no one wanted the quilts. Because I needed to remember that I was still here, still stitching, still worth something, still warm. If you've ever kept going after someone dismissed what you made, what you gave, or who you are, please subscribe to her Kindle. It helps this story reach someone else who needs it. And if you're not ready to subscribe, I get it, but I do want to know why. Scroll down and leave a comment. I'll read it. I promise. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I found the box. The sun was slanting just right through the back window, catching the dust in the air like it was dancing. I'd gone into the attic for something else, an old fan, I think because summer had crept up fast that year. The attic smelled like time, dry wood, old paper, and a faint trace of cedar. I hadn't been up there in a while. The boxes were stacked in crooked towers, labeled with Sharpie from decades ago. Some of them had my handwriting, some my mother's. One box was labeled Thanksgiving 92. Another just said, "Photos, do not toss." And then I saw it. It was tucked behind a plastic tub of Christmas lights, partly collapsed, the cardboard soft at the edges. The label was faded and curled, but I could still make it out. 1937 pattern, Ruth Ann's wedding star. My breath caught a little. I hadn't thought about that name in years. Ruth Ann was my grandmother's cousin. She got married in the middle of the Great Depression. The story was that my grandmother, barely 20 herself at the time, had stitched her a wedding quilt from salvaged fabrics, cotton shirts, feed sacks, even an old church dress. That quilt had a star pattern I'd only seen once in a yellowed photo buried in a family Bible. It had been passed down, the design sketched by hand on fragile paper, like a recipe meant only for certain hands to carry forward. And somehow, after all this time, the box had made its way into my attic. I carried it downstairs like it was glass, set it on the kitchen table, pulled up a chair. Inside were fabric scraps, brittle with age, wrapped in wax paper, a small spool of wooden thread, and at the bottom, folded carefully between two sheets of notebook paper, was the pattern, hand-drawn with tiny pencil marks and faint notes in my grandmother's cursive. Stitch carefully. Start from the center. Base slow. This one's meant to last. I must have sat there for an hour just looking at it. Something in me stirred. Not anger, not sadness. Something older than both. It felt like a doorway had cracked open. I pulled out my sewing journal. It wasn't fancy, just a lined notebook I kept on the shelf above my machine. I opened to a fresh page and wrote, June 3rd, found the Ruth Ann star. I'm going to try to bring it back. Not for anyone, just because. I made a pot of tea, pulled my chair into the sun, and I started. I traced the pattern onto new fabric, light cotton and soft florals and muted blues. I cut each piece by hand, not rotary blade. I wanted it to feel like 1937 again. I wanted to honor the hands that came before mine. Every evening, I stitched 2 or 3 blocks. I logged every step. I wrote what I was listening to, rain against the window, the radio, my own breath. Some days I didn't sew at all. I just read. I started looking up the history of Depression-era quilts. Turns out those designs, especially ones passed down through families, are part of what scholars call women's material history. They used that term in a Smithsonian article I found online. Material history. I read that women's quilts from that era weren't just pretty blankets. They were documents. They recorded hardship, hope, endurance. They told stories the history books skipped. And suddenly it hit me. This wasn't just a pattern. It was an heirloom, a message, a chapter of a story America didn't bother to tell, but one we kept alive in stitches. Kate once said, "No one wants old lady crafts." Well, maybe they didn't know what they were looking at. Maybe they'd forgotten what women like us carried. Maybe we let them forget. Each time I finished a piece of the star, I laid it out on the bed and just stared. The angles were sharp. The seams didn't pucker. The color balance was soft but strong, like a breath held between memory and pride. And with each stitch, I felt something return. It wasn't confidence. That word feels too loud. It was steadiness. Something settled in my chest. I wasn't doing this for Thomas, not for Kate, not even for Lily. I was doing it because there are some things you don't bury just because other people don't understand them. Some things are worth finishing. I didn't know then what would happen with the quilt. I didn't expect anyone to see it, but I knew it had to exist, because if I didn't carry this forward, who would? If the voices of women like my grandmother were written in fabric, then what kind of silence was I leaving behind by not adding mine? Kate said no one would care, but something in me said otherwise. If you've ever kept going after someone dismissed you, please subscribe to her Kindle. We tell stories that hold history, honor quiet strength, and stitch dignity back into places it's been forgotten. There's something holy about hand stitching in silence. No radio, no television, no phone in reach, just fabric, thread, and memory. I hadn't realized how noisy my world had become until I let it quiet down. The hum of the machine stayed off most days. I stitched by hand, slow, steady, 1 breath per needle pull. I'd start in the mornings right after my tea, before the sun got too high. The light in my sewing room would drift across the floor like a sleepy cat, warming the old wooden table where I kept my hoop and scissors. That quilt, the Ruth and Wedding Star, was more than a project by then. It became a rhythm, a way of holding onto something when the rest of the world made me feel like I didn't matter. Funny, isn't it? You can spend a whole lifetime being busy, raising children, paying bills, helping others, and still wake up one day and feel invisible. But in that quiet, I started to feel accompanied, not in a ghostly way, nothing spooky, just a knowing. I'd be halfway through a seam, and my hand would move a certain way, just like my mother's used to when she stitched through arthritis in her 70s. I'd pause to tie off a knot and remember my grandmother threading her needle by licking the end, squinting, muttering under her breath like the fabric owed her money. And sometimes I'd catch myself humming a tune I hadn't heard since I was 10, something my mother used to hum when ration stamps were tight, and dinner was mostly boiled potatoes. It wasn't sadness I felt. It was continuity, like I'd stepped into a current that had always been flowing, and now I was finally letting it carry me. I remember one morning, early June, the air thick with the kind of humidity that makes you feel like you're wearing the day itself. I was working on the inner border of the quilt, the hardest part, The points had to meet just right, or the entire star would look off-center. I was unpicking a seam for the third time when I felt this wave of frustration crawl up my neck. I wanted to quit, toss the whole thing into the cedar chest, and say, maybe Kate was right. No one cares. And then I looked over at the corner of the room. There was my mother's thimble in the ceramic bowl where I kept it, her initials still faintly scratched into the side. I picked it up, slid it onto my finger, and said out loud, "You didn't quit. I won't either." And I kept sewing. By the end of that week, the quilt top was done. I laid it out across the bed and just stared. The Ruth and wedding stars shined back at me in soft blues and creams, each point crisp, each seam aligned like a whispered prayer. I ran my hand over it and felt the years sewn between the fabric, the stories no one else saw, the women who came before, the hours I'd spent believing in something no one else had asked for. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something in me said this quilt wasn't meant to sit folded in a chest like the others. Not this one. I remembered reading about a digital archive run by a national textile preservation group. They collected photos and stories from American women who had contributed to the quilting tradition, especially lesser-known or undocumented works. It felt too big, too important, too out of reach. But still, I opened my laptop, took a photo of the quilt under the best light I could manage, and uploaded it. No name, no return address, just a simple note. Pattern, Ruth and Wedding Star, hand-stitched in 2023, based on a 1937 family design, passed down by Depression-era seamstresses, created in Ohio. I closed the laptop and went to bed, didn't think about it again, until 3 weeks later, an email popped into my inbox. Subject, quilt submission, we'd like to know more. It was from a young woman named Elise, and in turn, she said, with the American Textile Story Archive. She wrote, "The quilt you submitted is beautifully constructed, and the historical pattern is one we haven't seen in nearly a century. We're currently cataloging pieces for a Smithsonian-connected exhibit on underrepresented American quilt makers. We'd like to know more about the pattern, its history, and you." I sat back in my chair, hand over my mouth. Me? They wanted to know about me? It didn't feel real. I must have read that email 10 times before I even hit reply. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a moment, I thought about pretending I was someone else, giving them a story with more credentials, a name that didn't come with rolled eyes at family dinners. But I didn't. I told the truth, told them about Ruth, and about my grandmother's pencil pattern, about finding it in a dusty attic box when no one was looking, about making something in the quiet because it was all I had left. I didn't expect anything to come from it. But a few days later, Elise wrote back again. She said she'd shared it with the curatorial team. They were deeply moved. She said they would be in touch. I stared at that message and felt something loosen in my chest, like an old rope that had been pulled too tight for too long. I didn't cry, not right then, but I did go sit in my sewing room, held that thimble, and whispered, "Mama, they saw it. They saw me. So far, if this story made something stir in you, even a little, I hope you'll subscribe to her Kindle. Because stories like this, they don't go viral. They go quiet until someone like you helps carry them forward." The email came in the middle of a Tuesday. I'd just come back from the grocery store. There was a bag of potatoes still sitting on the counter, and my coat hadn't even made it to the hook yet. I opened my laptop just to check the weather, and there it was. Subject, formal invitation from the Smithsonian American History Museum. At first, I thought it was spam. One of those scams where they pretend you've won something and ask for your bank information. I hovered over the trash icon with my mouse. My heart told me not to click, but something in my chest said, just read it. So I did. The message was clean, polite, formal in a way that felt real. There was no request for money, no links asking for downloads. It was from the office of the Folk Textiles and Craft Heritage Division at the Smithsonian Institution. They had reviewed my quilt submission. Elise, the intern, had apparently passed along my follow-up notes and photos. The email said, "We would be honored to feature your piece in our upcoming exhibit, Unseen Hands, Women Who Stitched America." The quilt is a rare original heirloom pattern executed with exceptional fidelity and historical accuracy. Your work reflects the unacknowledged legacy of American women whose labor quietly shaped the cultural fabric of our country. I had to read that sentence 3 times before I could take a full breath. They were serious. They wanted my quilt, to hang in the Smithsonian, the same building where Lincoln's hat and Rosa Parks' dress lived. Me, Laura Rogers, widow, mother, Sunday school teacher, invisible matriarch of the Rogers line. I sat down. The potatoes stayed on the counter. I didn't even take my coat off. I just read that email again, letting each word soak into a part of me I thought had gone quiet years ago. They weren't just asking for the quilt. They wanted to include a short video segment about my process. They said the exhibit would travel between DC, Boston, and Chicago over 18 months, and would also be featured in a digital collection for public education. I stared at the screen. My finger hovered over reply, and I froze, because for a moment, just one breath, I didn't believe it. All those years of being told I was just a housewife, or just grandma, or not really the artistic type. All those years where my work was folded, boxed, and buried in cedar chests while the world praised others with fancier names and louder voices. It had soaked in too deep, even when the truth stood in front of me, signed by a Smithsonian curator. I didn't think I was worthy. I almost deleted the email. I thought it was a mistake, or worse, a cruel joke, because when you've been told you're nothing, it's hard to believe anyone might see something in you. But then I looked over at the quilt, still draped over the guest bed. I ran my fingers over the seams, the star points, the hand-stitched curves. I knew every inch of it, every hidden knot, every invisible repair. And I whispered, out loud, I did this. I wrote back, kept the message simple, professional, thankful. I agreed to ship the quilt. I agreed to record the video. Then I sat there at my kitchen table, coat still on, potatoes still sweating in the plastic bag. And I cried, not loudly, not like in the movies, just a quiet stream, slow and warm. I cried for the 22-year-old girl who made her first log cabin block and tore it apart when her neighbors said it looked wonky. I cried for the mother who stayed up past midnight mending school pants while the kids slept. I cried for the wife who made anniversary quilts that sat in closets, untouched. I cried for the woman who gave and gave and gave, and only just now realized that something she made would hang where the country keeps its sacred things. The potatoes could wait. For the next 2 days, I was in a daze. The Smithsonian sent over shipping instructions, a release form, and a schedule for the video interview. Elise emailed again, this time with a personal note. When I saw your quilt, I thought of my grandmother. She used to sew late at night, too. She never got any recognition, but she made beauty out of scraps. I just wanted to say thank you. You reminded me she mattered. I printed that one, put it on my fridge. That night, I made myself a cup of peppermint tea and sat in my sewing room. I looked around at the spools, the scraps, the thimbles, the bins of fabric. None of it looked fancy. None of it came with titles or medals or certificates, but it had held me up during the worst years of my life. And now it had opened a door I didn't even know I needed. The envelope was heavier than it looked. It arrived on a Thursday, tucked between a gardening catalog and an electric bill. Ivory, thick cardstock, gold-trimmed edge. No return address, just a wax seal with the Smithsonian crest, and my name printed in small, formal type, Mrs. Laura E. Rogers. I stood at the mailbox, holding it like it might shatter. Inside were 2 printed invitations. One for me, one for a guest of my choosing. They had weight to them, not just physically, but symbolically. Formal script, embossed lettering, the kind of invitation people frame behind glass. You are cordially invited to attend the opening ceremony of Unseen Hands, Women Who Stitched America, presented by the Smithsonian American History Museum, honoring your contribution to America's living textile heritage. There it was, in print, in gold ink. I ran my thumb across the word honoring, and for a moment, I had to sit down on the porch steps. I hadn't told Thomas or Kate about the exhibit yet. I wasn't sure how to, wasn't sure if I wanted to, but something inside me, something old and firm, said it was time they saw what silence had missed. So that Sunday, I baked a peach cobbler and brought it with me to their house. First time I'd been back since the pie. Kate opened the door and blinked. "Oh, come in, I guess." She looked behind me like she expected someone else. "Thomas is watching the game." I walked in, cobbler in hand, and set it gently on the counter. Then I pulled the envelope from my purse and placed it beside the dish. "I brought something else," I said. Kate raised an eyebrow. "Is this a quilt thing?" "It's an invitation." She opened it slowly, like she expected it to be a church flyer. Her eyes scanned the first few lines. And then she stopped. She read the paragraph again. And again. I watched her jaw tighten, watched her hand hover over the second card, the one labeled Guest of the Artist. She said nothing. She didn't congratulate me, didn't ask a single question. She just turned and said, "Thomas." He shuffled in from the living room, beer in hand, half distracted. Kate handed him the invitation. He read it with his lips slightly parted, like he wasn't sure what he was looking at. Then he looked at me. "Wait, your quilt? This is about you." I nodded. Kate finally spoke. "They actually want your quilt? Like, for the museum?" "Yes," I said plainly. "It'll be on display in Washington, then Boston, then Chicago." She let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I mean, wow, I didn't realize the Smithsonian had such broad taste. Thomas gave her a quick look, then said to me, "That's something, Mom." "Really?" His voice was polite, careful, the kind of tone you use when you've underestimated someone and don't know how to fix it. I left the envelope on the counter. "I thought you two might want to come." I said, "No pressure, but you're welcome." Then I picked up my purse and left the cobbler behind. 2 days later, I got a message request on Facebook. A woman named Tracy, someone I didn't know, wrote, "Hi, Laura. I just heard you're going to be part of the Unseen Hands exhibit. My cousin Elise interns at the archive. She said your quilt is stunning. So proud of you." I blinked at the screen. The news was traveling. By Friday, the Smithsonian's press release had gone live. My name was listed on their website, alongside women from Mississippi, California, Iowa, and Pennsylvania. Some were lifelong textile artists. Some, like me, were names no one had heard. Until now, a local NPR affiliate called and asked if I'd be willing to record a short interview about the piece. The producer said, "We've had a lot of interest in heritage craft stories this season. Your quilt has a quiet power to it." Quiet power. I wrote that down later in my sewing journal, not because I believed it yet, but because I wanted to. The interview was short, just 15 minutes over the phone. I sat in my sewing room while I talked. The host asked about the Ruthin pattern, about how I rediscovered it, what it meant to me. She asked, How did it feel to be overlooked for so long before this? I paused. Then I said, most women I know don't need spotlights. We just want our work to be seen for what it is. Whole, honest, done with care. There was a silence on the other end. Then the host said, that's going to stay with me. I ended the call, folded up the phone cord, and sat with my hands in my lap. The email had changed everything, but the silence after, that was where it started to sink in. Kate hadn't said anything since that Sunday. No text, no call. Part of me wondered if she was embarrassed, or maybe confused, or maybe finally realizing she'd missed something valuable right under her nose. It wasn't revenge, I felt. Not pride either. It was something steadier, like being returned to myself. I didn't make that quilt to prove anything, but maybe that's why it mattered. Because it wasn't about applause. It was about truth. And now it would hang in a building that held America's truths. Right alongside them. I almost deleted the email. I thought it was a scam. Because when you've been told you're nothing, it's hard to believe anyone might see something in you. If this makes you feel something, anything, please subscribe to her Kindle. This story belongs to us. And if you've ever felt like you missed your moment, tell me below. I flew into Washington the day before the exhibit opened. They offered to send a car, but I politely declined. I wanted to take the city in on my own terms. I hadn't been to D.C. since I was in my 20s, back when Thomas was still in a stroller and his father was still alive. I stayed at a modest hotel not far from the National Mall. It was quiet, simple, just like I liked it. I laid out my good blouse the night before and set 2 alarms, even though I was wide awake by 5. I got to the Smithsonian just before the doors opened. The building stood like a stone memory, grand without shouting, dignified in a way that reminded me of my grandmother's church hat, old, proud, and still holding its shape. Inside, the air was cool and hushed, not silent exactly, but filled with the kind of reverence people bring to places that hold what matters. I signed in with the staff at the exhibit desk. A young woman named Avery clicked on my badge, featured maker, Laura Rogers. She smiled warmly. "We're honored to have you here, Mrs. Rogers. Would you like me to walk you in?" I shook my head gently. "No, thank you. I'd like to see it myself first." And I did. I walked slowly through the exhibit, past works from women whose names had likely never been spoken in a textbook, African-American quilters from Alabama, homesteader blankets from Nebraska, and a stunning wool piece stitched by hand during the Civil War. I stopped at that one for a long time. The stitches were tiny, careful. Someone had made it during a time of unimaginable grief. And still, they sewed. Then I turned the corner. There it was, Ruth Ann's wedding star, my quilt, hanging under soft gallery lights, pressed gently into a frame that showed every inch. To the left, a Navajo textile wove through the wall with rich reds and ochres balanced against the blue and cream tones of mine. Together, they looked like 2 voices in a shared song, different languages, same rhythm. I stepped closer. Closer still. The sign beside the quilt read, 1937 pattern, hand replicated in 2023 by Laura Rogers, Ohio. Originally passed down through 3 generations of Depression-era women. Preserved by the artist with precision, love, and an unbroken legacy of American craft. I placed my hand over my heart. That's what it felt like being placed back where I belonged. A small family stood nearby. Mother, father, teenage daughter. They weren't speaking loudly, just murmuring. The girl leaned in close and whispered, "Look at the stitching on this one. It's perfect." Her mother nodded. You can tell it was made with real care. I didn't say anything. I just watched from a few feet away, quiet and still, tears gathering without spilling. I never needed to be famous. I just needed to know someone saw it. A few minutes later, a docent walked up behind me. He was maybe in his late 50s, dressed sharply with glasses perched on his nose. He looked at the quilt, then at me. "Mrs. Rogers?" I nodded. "I just wanted to tell you," he said, "this is one of the most historically accurate replications we've seen from the 20th century. The precision of your seams, the thread count, even the fabrics you chose. It's remarkable." I didn't have words, just a quiet, "Thank you." He smiled kindly. "It's more than beautiful. It's important." For a woman who'd been told most of her life that her skills were quaint, that moment wrapped itself around every insult I'd ever swallowed. Every time Kate had rolled her eyes. Every time someone said, "That's cute, but do you sell them?" Every time my quilts ended up under someone's dog or in a closet, none of it could touch this, because now strangers were stopping to read my name. They weren't just seeing fabric. They were seeing a story. My story. Later that afternoon, I stayed for the curator talk. The head of the textile department stood at the podium and spoke about the exhibit's mission: to honor the unseen hands, women who didn't wait for permission to create, who stitched not for applause, but for permanence, and in doing so, helped build the foundation of American culture. When she said my name, my heart skipped. Laura Rogers, whose work represents the quiet durability of Midwest quilting tradition, has given us not only a quilt, but a connection to family, to history, and to the resilience of women across generations. I looked down at my lap, hands folded, thumbs pressed gently together. It wasn't pride I felt. It was peace. I stayed until closing. I walked the exhibit twice more. I listened to whispers from strangers, watched fingers gently trace air just inches from thread. At one point, I saw Avery again. She came up and said softly, "I hope this makes you feel seen." I nodded. "It does." She handed me a keepsake card, a small photo of my quilt printed on museum stock. At the bottom, it read, "A contribution to American memory." I tucked it into my purse. Later that night, in my hotel room, I pulled it out again and stared at it under the lamp. They said it was a contribution to American memory. Not bad for someone who was once told she had nothing to offer. Not bad at all. If her Kindle helps you feel seen, please hit subscribe, because stories like mine and yours don't make the front page, but they do deserve a place in the world. And if you think all of this is just a coincidence, well, I hope you'll say so in the comments. The phone rang on a Tuesday morning, just after I'd finished folding laundry and was about to sit down with my tea. Unknown number, Washington area code. For a second, I thought maybe it was a follow-up from the Smithsonian about the exhibit wrap-up. Maybe someone needed a photo or a quote. I didn't expect the voice on the other end to say, so gently, "Mrs. Rogers, this is Elise, again from the Smithsonian. I hope you're doing well. We have a request." She paused like she wasn't sure how to ask. "The curatorial team is developing a follow-up exhibit," she said, "focused on legacy making in domestic crafts, especially women who've passed on skills across generations. It'll be titled Hands That Hold. And we were wondering, would you consider submitting a second piece?" For a moment, I just held the phone to my ear, staring at the mug in my hand. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Oh, we're very sure," she said, brightening. "We'd love to feature your voice again." She mentioned they were especially interested in pieces rooted in personal teaching or heritage. A quilt that came with a story, not just thread. I told her I'd think about it, and she understood. But deep down, I already knew my answer. After I hung up, I walked into my sewing room, pulled the blinds halfway open, and stared at the baskets stacked along the far wall. old patterns, forgotten tops, and a few fabric sets I'd been saving for something special. This was it. This was the reason I'd held onto them all these years. I chose a block called Lover's Knot. My mother taught it to me in 1974, right after I had Thomas. She said, "This one holds. Strong seams. Clean corners. It doesn't fall apart." That always stuck with me. I decided I'd do it entirely by hand again. No machines. No shortcuts. One stitch at a time. It felt right. 3 days later, the phone rang again. This time it was Thomas. I hadn't heard from him in weeks, not since the exhibit opened. His voice was quieter than usual, less rushed. "Hey, Mom, I've been meaning to call. Lily's got this home EC elective next semester. Sewing basics. She said she wants to learn, but the school's short on machines, and they only do pillows. I was wondering, would you maybe teach her?" I leaned back in my chair. He waited. "I could drop her off this Saturday," he added, "if that works." I smiled softly. That would be fine. There was a pause. Then he said, "She saw your quilt online, by the way. Said it looked like something from a storybook." I cleared my throat. Well, maybe it is. When Saturday came, Lily showed up with a canvas tote bag and wide eyes. She walked into the sewing room like it was a chapel. "Wow," she whispered. "Did you make all of these?" "Most," I said. She pointed to a sampler pinned on the wall. "That one looks like a maze." "Lover's Knot," I said. "Want to learn it?" She nodded. We started small. How to thread a needle. How to knot it so it didn't slip. How to run a straight line without puckering the fabric. She caught on quick. Quieter than I remembered her being. Less distracted. At one point, she looked up and said, "Why didn't Dad ever say you were famous?" I chuckled. "I'm not famous." She tilted her head. "But your quilt's in a museum." I shrugged. "That doesn't make me famous. Just seen." Later, I stepped out to grab lemonade from the fridge, and I overheard her talking to someone on the phone. "I'm at Grandma's," she said. "We're sewing. She's really good at it." Something in my chest unclenched. A part one didn't know was still tight. That evening, as they were leaving, Thomas lingered in the doorway. "She had a good time," he said. "She's welcome any time." I replied. Then I added, looking him square in the eye, "But I'm doing this for her. Not for approval. Not to prove anything." He nodded. Slowly. "I get that." He meant it. I think. That night, I lit a candle in the sewing room, something I hadn't done in years, and sat down at the table. My fingers moved with purpose. Confident. Steady. The lover's knot was forming again. Block by block. And this time, I was adding something extra, my story. A stitched panel on the back with names, dates, and a line that read, "Taught to me by Mama, passed to Lily, stitched with hands that remember." It wasn't about being remembered in history books. It wasn't even about being hung in another museum. It was about legacy, the kind that doesn't always come with applause, but lasts longer than anyone realizes. It was about telling the next girl, the next granddaughter, the next woman who sits quietly in a corner thinking she's too late. You're not. If this reminded you of something you've passed down, or wish someone had passed to you, please subscribe to her Kindle. It helps stories like this keep breathing. And if you've never subscribed to anything, but felt this one tug at you, I'd still like to hear why in the comments. We don't push here. We pass things down. It started with a flyer. I printed it on yellow paper at the public library, bold font, nothing fancy. Free quilting circle, beginners and rusty hands, welcome. Hosted by Laura Rogers, every Wednesday, 2 to 4 p.m., Community Room B. I posted it on the bulletin board near the library checkout desk and walked away without expecting anything. That was the first week of October. By the second week, we had 6 women. By the third, We had 11. Some came with tote bags of fabric that smelled like old cedar chests. Others showed up with nothing but nervous hands and quiet eyes. A few brought stories that had never been told out loud. Marianne, 73, hadn't picked up a needle in 40 years. My fingers forgot everything. She laughed, but they hadn't. Cheryl, 67, had never sewn a thing in her life. She brought store-bought potholders to study until I handed her a needle and said, "We learn by doing here." Then there was Joyce, 84. She hadn't spoken to her daughter in 7 years. She didn't say why. She just sewed silently until the 4th meeting, when she finally looked up and whispered, "I forgot how it feels to be useful." We didn't just stitch fabric. We stitched back pieces of ourselves. Some weeks, we laughed until we cried over crooked seams, tangled bobbins, or spilled coffee on a half-finished square. Other weeks, we sat in silence, the rhythm of our hands saying everything we couldn't. No one cared how fancy the patterns were. No one judged. There were no judges in that room. Just women with weathered hands, whole hearts, and decades of living tucked between our fingers. Someone donated a rack of rotary cutters. Someone else brought muffins. The library extended our hours. I brought in my extra scissors, my best pins, even my old Singer on days we needed speed. But mostly we worked by hand, one stitch at a time, like we were anchoring each other back to the earth. I started calling us the quiet thread. The name caught on. One day, a younger woman walked in. Her name was Olivia. She was 39, freshly divorced, and said her mother had sewn in secret after dinner every night. She joined us with shaking hands. I watched as Joyce leaned over and said, "Come sit by me. I'll show you how Grandma taught me." That moment stuck with me, because this was never just about quilts. It was about making room for ourselves, for each other, for the things no one else had valued when we needed them to. It was about unlearning the lie that our time had passed. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything. Not to Thomas, not to Kate, not even to myself. The quilt for the Smithsonian's second exhibit was finished just after Thanksgiving. I folded it into tissue, wrote a short letter, and mailed it off. The panel on the back said, "Made by the hands of one, taught by the hearts of many." They emailed me again, calling it a living link in the chain of cultural legacy. I smiled, then turned off the computer. Back in Community Room B, we were working on a group quilt. Each woman designed her own square. We called it Patchwork of Persistence. We'd hang it in the library when it was done. No fanfare, no ribbon cutting, just a stitched testimony of women who refused to vanish. A few weeks later, Lily stopped by one of our Wednesday circles. She brought a friend. They watched, asked questions, and stayed an hour. She gave me a hug when she left. "I want to learn this for real," she said. "You already are," I told her. That night, I walked home slower than usual. It was cold. My fingers ached, but my heart felt full, rooted. And that's when it hit me. Kate once called me a failure, said I had nothing to offer. But somewhere in Washington, behind glass and soft light, my stitches still speak. They speak of women who held whole generations together without asking for credit. They speak of memories that were never written down, only handed down. They speak of love sewn in silence. And I didn't do it for Kate. I didn't even do it for the Smithsonian. I did it for every woman who was told she was too old, too quiet, or too late. You're not. You never were. If this story meant anything to you, please subscribe to her Kindle. YouTube doesn't show stories like this to more women unless you engage. If you hit that button, you help these stitches travel just a little further.